Hello, everyone. This is Whitney Will from Starheart Astrology, and this is your year ahead forecast for 2025 for Capricorn rising. Thank you guys for requesting this video. I know we're 3 weeks into 2025, but all this stuff is still relevant. I am an Aquarius rising, and I always forget during Capricorn season, that means the sun is in my 12th house, and I like it's very hard. Lots of illness, lots of 12th housey things going on. But now it's Aquarius season. We are back in action, can handle being seen again. So here we are for your 2025 forecast. Big things afoot. And we start out right in the middle of all of this complication due to this ongoing Mars retrograde. Mars retrogrades back into Cancer, where it will be until mid-April, which means for Capricorn risings that the first part of the year is characterized by a retrograde Mars in your seventh house of relationships. And this can be super frustrating in terms of managing conflict, managing who you're in relationship with, feeling very mired in the emotions of things, not being able to move at things directly in the way that you'd like to, right? Maybe not being able to communicate clearly or advocate for yourself, or even kind of like know what you want in that space. So it's a frustrating time. And if any of that rings true for you, it would have come up in the last week or so when we had Mars opposite the Sun on January 15th. And as I'm recording this on January 21st, we have Mercury approaching an opposition with Mars tomorrow. So that is really aggravating that, depending on what degree your ascendant, descendant axis is on. Mars is possibly retrograding over your descendant and opposing your ascendant. So this is a lot of like emotional aggression, frustration coming from your reflection of other people, right? From your relationships. Not a super fun start to the year. And part of being a Capricorn rising is, right, depending on if you have a day chart or a night chart with the sun below the horizon or above the horizon, you will either have, right, your chart ruled by Saturn, and Saturn being the less problematic malefic and Mars being the more problematic one. Or you will have the opposite situation where your entire chart is ruled by your out of sect malefic, and Mars is your more helpful of the two malefics. And my point about that is that if you have a day chart, then this Mars retrograde might be a little bit more difficult and feel a little bit more painful. Whereas if you were born with the sun below the horizon, then this Mars retrograde, while still frustrating, might end up being a little bit more helpful in clarifying things in your relationships with other people. And that's really the main story for January and February, and really the key transit of those time periods. We do get the nodal shift depending on how you count the nodes. We have the North Node moving into Pisces either mid-January or at the end of January. The nodes are triggered by eclipses, so this might not be felt so much as a transit in those moments, but it's a leaning into the North Node in Pisces, which is, of course, your third house of engaging with your community, of communicating your thoughts, of channeling your like great and developed worldview into language and attempting that, and kind of with the South Node in Virgo, maybe not getting so lost in the weeds of it, or at least having this draw of like I mean, it's kind of the nodes in this position are kind of like, is nothing easy? Like, we just need to let go and stop trying to micromanage everything. But sometimes easier said than done. We also have Venus entering the shadow of her retrograde on January 28th. So she will have moved to the past 24 degrees of Pisces, which is the degree that she's going to retrograde back to. She's been in Pisces since January 2nd, I think. So she's in the sign of her exaltation. She's very benevolent in that space. I think there's a lot of dreams about what is to come, positive and negative. More negative until she completes her first conjunction with Saturn, and maybe more positive, but a little bit more delusional as she approaches her extended conjunction with Neptune and the North Node as we get into the year. She is going to station retrogrades at the very beginning of March in the sign of Aries. But first, before that, we get Mars's direct station on February 24th, stationing direct at 17 degrees of Cancer, from which point Mars will be moving direct and will re-enter Leo on April 17th. March and April are the most exciting in the sense of volatile things happening, very dynamic, lots and lots going on, by far the most intense period of the year. And so much for you, Capricorn rising. It's all happening in Aries. So, right, this is the place of your home. This is your foundation. This is that cardinal urge to make things and create things that get so refined through the Capricorn rising life cycle. But we have Venus stationing retrograde, and she does that on March 1st. And then on March 13th, we have a Virgo eclipse. So that is an eclipse in your 9th house in your big picture. On March 14th, we have Mercury stationing retrograde at nearly the same degree that Venus did. So Mercury starts moving retrograde in Aries as well. On March 29th, we have a solar eclipse in Aries at the same degree, and we have Neptune ingress into Aries. So 2 eclipses, 2 retrogrades. Mars is freshly out of his retrograde. Neptune is about to change signs. Venus ingresses back into Pisces as part of her retrograde, spends a lot of time with Saturn and the North Node. And so we have this complicated layer of Venus retrogrades making us feel ambivalent, or Venus retrogrades more about confronting our ambivalence about things. And so she moves backwards in that 4th house space, which is the space of your foundation, of what grounds you, of your history, of your knowledge of who you are and what home is and what home looks like. And then Mercury follows suit in that space at nearly the same time as there is a lunar eclipse in the sign of Virgo that's up there. And there is maybe this urge to move or decide whether you are going to move, decide if you are in the right position for the work that you intend to do for the next bit. This Venus retrograde is the next iteration of the Venus and Aries retrogrades. The last one happened during February, March of 2017. So you may see similar themes come up from that. Then we have our Aries eclipse, which is the final of 3 solar eclipses that we have experienced in Aries. 3 new beginnings on the North Node, bringing new iterations into that area of our life. And really for you this year, and this leans right into the Neptune and the Sagittarius pieces. Neptune and Saturn are going to have an extended time in your 4th house. With Neptune in your fourth house, it doesn't tend to be as chaotic, nomadic wise, as Uranus in the fourth, but there is this kind of holy longing to return to something that makes you almost a kind of wanderer. And so we have these kind of contradictory, in some ways, planets of Saturn trying to create something and really build something and create some solidity and some structure, and Neptune spinning the beautiful delulus about what's really being done in that space. And that, we'll get a good chunk of it in 2025 before they both retrograde back in the fall into Pisces, but then they will ingress again in 2026. And Neptune is going to be there for more than a decade, and Saturn will give us 3 years there. So, right, really, really leaning into the Aries thing, taking really good notes, and then adjusting your expectations accordingly, because your home, your house foundation, and what it means is undergoing a period of intense change. That Virgo eclipse that happens kind of in the midst of all of it, while its ruler, Mercury, is stationing retrograde, is this kind of taking stock of what your beliefs are and how you are really living them or not living them. So that, right, this space that grounds you, your relationship with yourself, which I think is so much a part of the Capricorn rising fourth house, and how you come home to yourself and how you treat yourself, right? That churns with the eclipses and the retrogrades. As we move into April, Venus stations direct. Mercury stations direct first at about 27 degrees of Pisces, and then Venus stations direct on April 12th. They both move forward to the end of Pisces, but they're going to be in their post shadow. So they're going to be integrating everything that they have learned. And for Venus, some of really the deep commitments of all of her time with Saturn. Mars will move into Leo on the 17th. Still not out of the post shadow of its retrograde. And remember, one of the key features of this Mars retrograde was Mars's opposition with Pluto. And so this will be the third of 3 oppositions that Mars has with Pluto. So whatever was going on for you around New Year's with potential conflict or kind of incinerating things is likely to come back up around the end of April, when Mars makes that final opposition with Pluto on April 26th. On April 30th, Venus will move back into Aries. So again, not out of her post shadow, but back into Aries. And this piece I'm really paying attention to, because all of her time in Aries and her retrograde time in Aries all had Mars in Cancer, in the sign of its fall. And so really struggling. It's almost like Mars dropping the ball on leadership. And so Venus having to step into this more masculine leadership role, this more proactive leadership role, as Mars is struggling to navigate it. But then when Mars moves into Leo, where it's not debilitated and is through that opposition with Pluto, doing a lot better, is now in a trine with Neptune, right? It can really get carried away on its mission, and Venus doesn't have to do so much of the heavy lifting there in Aries without good leadership. Venus will conjoin Neptune at the beginning of May, and that will give us this taste of Neptune in Aries and some of the things that that portends. We will have Pluto station retrograde in the beginning of May at almost 4 degrees of Aquarius. So that's as far into Aquarius as Pluto is going to get in 2025. But Pluto is done retrograding back into Capricorn. So we'll have that piece. At the end of May, on May 24th, Saturn will ingress into Aries, being one of the main big shifts. Saturn in Aries is in its fall. So for you, Capricorn rising, you have your chart ruler in the sign of its fall. And so it's worth sitting and really connecting with Saturn in Aries and really reflecting on why Saturn is in its fall in Aries, right? Saturn is the long game and discipline, whereas Aries is impulse to action and quick thinking and leaping before you look. And Saturn, right, tends to have two effects. One is it's kind of the wet blanket on that. It is the doubt that snuffs out the flame before it can light the fire, so to speak. Or, right, it's like masquerading as like tough love and makes you finish something that you never should have started, pushes things to the extreme. Saturn and Aries can become very dogmatic and very rigid for a sign that, you know, needs movement, and Saturn does not move that well. So, right, I mean, more than anything, their contradictions are about speed. Saturn ruling slowness and stuckness, and Aries thriving in that sacred creative fire. And so that could be harsh, right? Saturn at some point during its transit of Aries is going to square your ascendant. You're going to have the like anchor pulling back into the history that is contained in the fourth house and really forcing your self-concept, your identity, the way you view yourself to wrestle with some of those pieces. So that is part of that. At the beginning of June, though, we get this really wonderful thing. Around June 5th, Venus enters Taurus. So we've got our wonderful Benefic back in the sign of her rulership. And then just 4 days later, we have Jupiter leaving Gemini for Cancer, the sign of his exaltation. So we have both of our benefics in very good condition, in a sextile with each other immediately. And so Venus will be in Taurus until the beginning of July, and Jupiter will be in Cancer for about a year. So we have some really sweet moments, and I think that really softens. That's really the kind of turning point from a lot of the complicated struggles that characterize the first part of the year, and especially the first 4 months. We will have Mars leaving Leo with a bang, because the last thing that happens before Mars ingresses into Virgo on June 15th is that Mars squares Uranus at the end of Taurus. So there's some incendiary things that happen there, but then we finally get Mars in a new sign, in the sign of Virgo, very much dedicated to making us make efficient choices and cleaning up our own messes. Has been in either Cancer or Leo since September 3rd, 4th of 2024. So we have had a really, really extended experience of Mars in your 8th and 7th whole sign houses. And finally, it moves into your 9th house, and it can kind of come to attend possibly some of what that mid-March eclipse was about, and kind of be able to move on that. Kind of simultaneously, we have the third and final of this series, Jupiter-Saturn square. The first two happened between Gemini and Pisces in June of 2024 and on Christmas Eve of 2024. Now that they've both ingressed into new signs, we're finding them negotiating with very different terms with Cancer and Aries. We also have Jupiter exalted and Saturn in its fall. So these are very different confrontations that we see at this point between the two of them. We have a beautiful Sun-Jupiter conjunction that happens on June 24th. The Sun joins Jupiter in Cancer, the moon sign. At the same time, or maybe shortly before that, we have a Moon-Venus conjunction in Taurus. And it's one of my favorite moments of 2025, because you get the exalted moon with Venus in rulership, and then you get the Sun with an exalted Jupiter. So you have the luminaries with very empowered benefics. It's just a really sweet midsummer. And then it's followed by my favorite lunation of the year, which is the new moon in Cancer that happens on June 26th. And so this, I really think, is the balm in your relationships, Capricorn rising, after that Mars retrograde. That was such an extended transit there, with Jupiter coming there and then having a new moon. After that, we kind of have this like ritual bathing, cleansing space to re-bless that space and like get out whatever was in there. And hopefully Mars cleared everything out and then Jupiter can create something new and wonderful. As we get into Q3, we see Venus's conjunction with Uranus right as Uranus is at the very, very, very end of Taurus. So I think there's a sweet moment of Venus, you know, walking Uranus to the door of her sign, although she will technically leave before Uranus. Neptune is going to station retrograde right on the 4th of July at 2 degrees of Aries. So that's as far into Aries as Neptune is going to get. And then on July 7th, Uranus will move into Gemini. So Uranus moving into Gemini, it moves into your 6th house of work, of illness and injury, of kind of chores and routine. And when Uranus moves into that space, it can really upend those areas. You get restless in any job that you feel like is boring to you or is not stimulating enough, is not in tune with where you're at, is not in alignment with your beliefs and your principles. You might move on because you're starting really new creative things, right? The kind of gorgeous and mystical quality of this is that we are going to have Pluto just newly in your 2nd house of personal resources and what you do for money, trining Uranus in Gemini, and then they both sextile Saturn and Neptune. And so, you know, I could see like a career change, but it's not so much like you're moving on to a different position, but that the world of work is going to change so drastically in the next several decades that the type of work that you will be doing will be so different that you can't even fathom what it will be now. But part of that Capricorn rising and staying on top of things would be kind of leaning into that. And with Uranus and with Pluto, it's kind of like lean in or get dragged. So yeah, big shifts in those areas. We have Saturn stationing retrograde in the middle of July at 1.5 degrees of Aries. So we'll get a big emphasis there of what that's looking like and what that means. And then we have our 2nd Mercury retrograde of the year that is in Leo that begins on July 17th. This is the only Mercury retrograde of 2025 that is entirely within one sign. So we get Mercury retrograde in your 8th house, which has to do with your negotiations with other people, what you think you owe them, what they think you owe you, the shadowy parts of relationships, and how we handle those deep and dark parts. Shortly into that, we will have the Sun's opposition with Pluto Aquarius, which will be interesting. It'll be interesting to check in towards the end of July and see how the opposition manifests. As we enter into the beginning of August, we get some interesting pieces. Mars will move into Libra and oppose Saturn and Neptune in Aries. And at that same moment, it will create a grand trine with Pluto and Uranus. So Mars is really going to activate and bring light to the significations of the outer planets at that point. Mercury will station direct almost immediately after that at 4 degrees of Leo, which I'm paying attention to that degree because that's nearly the degree that Mars stationed retrograde at in the fall of 2024. So it does feel like if there's unfinished business, like conversations that you still need to have, then that Mercury retrograde is really about like, okay, I'm going to complete that piece and remember the Mars and Leo piece and be an aid and assistant to that. We have another really sweet moment of Venus conjunct Jupiter in Cancer that same day. So, that sounds like that's powerful reconciliation. That's letting go. That's, hugging and crying it out. As we enter September, Saturn retrogrades immediately into Pisces on September 1st. So we kind of end our summer prelude of all of these outer planets and their new signs. So Saturn's back into Pisces to finish up unfinished business there. Uranus will station retrograde a few days later at 1.5 degrees of Gemini. So kind of slowing down that show as well. And then on September 7th, we get a Pisces lunar eclipse. Yeah, a Pisces lunar eclipse at 13 degrees of Pisces, and we're back into eclipse season. But this is an eclipse season that, for one thing, will have a Pisces eclipse and a Virgo eclipse, so entirely within that axis. And we're going to be able to see it a lot more clearly because we won't have the overlay of all of these planetary retrogrades happening on top. So that'll be a time to really kind of decipher what this eclipse cycle really looks like for you, and that tension between the 9th and 3rd houses, and practicing what you preach and how you live out your values on a daily basis. The Virgo solar eclipse is a bit of a strange eclipse. It's the only solar eclipse in this eclipse cycle. All of the rest of them are lunar. And it happens at 29 degrees of Virgo opposite Saturn at 28 degrees of Pisces. So often we talk about with solar eclipses that they are like a supercharged new moon, which is a kind of new beginning. This one kind of doomed from the start. It's a new beginning at the anaretic degree of the sign on the south node, which kind of minimizes things, wants to spiritualize them, take them out of the corporeal reality. And it's opposite Saturn, restriction and blocking. So it's really like, it's a new moon, not for bringing anything new in, but for pushing stuff out. And so that the thing that is created is just spaciousness, which is incredibly difficult for Virgos to find that spaciousness and peacefulness in their minds. And for the Virgoan part of all of us. Quarter 4, we really have Pluto stationing direct in the beginning of October at 1.5 degrees of Aquarius. We have Neptune retrograding back into Aries by October 22nd. We have Uranus retrograding back into Taurus November 7th. So we kind of have this great rewind. Jupiter will station retrograde on November 11th. Mercury will station retrograde on November 9th at 6 degrees of Sagittarius. And so then we're in a more contemplative, it's kind of like rewind, listen to the end of 2024 again, because the end of 2025, like the end of 2024, is a Mercury retrograde in Sagittarius. We have Saturn in Pisces and Neptune in Pisces and Uranus back in Taurus. And we kind of end where we began for a lot of these outer planets, but not for Mars, because in that process, Mars has come all the way around. And when we end 2025, Mars is in Capricorn, in your sign, in the sign of its exaltation, coming to a conjunction with the Sun and Venus. And so constellating and concentrating power in your first house. So in some ways, this is a story, at least where Mars is concerned for Capricorn rising, of being frustrated, not being able to make headway in the beginning, not having the kind of support you need, not being able to find the teammates that you need, and then, right, developing that strength. And by the end of the year, being quite empowered with your ability to act independently, which we will very much need you as a leader in the years to come with your special intentional gifts. That's what I have for you. Thank you for watching this, and thank you for your patience while I got it out there. If you want me to look at your chart in a personal way, you can go to my website and book a one-on-one reading, and we can look at what the year ahead looks like for you more intentionally. I'd love to see you there. Okay, bye.